Okay, thank you very much. So, dear colleagues, I am happy to introduce you, although I'm sure most of you know, Dr. Ludomir L.Lozny, well, I should say renowned archaeologist. I think I will not be mistaken if I call you, well, Polish-American archaeologist and anthropologist.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, well, and it's a great pleasure for us to have his 2 talks now and next Thursday at our International Center of Anthropology seminar. And I'm glad to welcome you all. And just let me announce the topic of Dr. L.Lozny's today's talk. The title is Sphere of Authority as an Analytical Tool to Assess the Level of Political Aggregation, Disaggregation. So, Ludomir, you are most welcome.
Thank you, Dmitry. I want to thank you first for identifying my interests and assessing that those interests might be interesting enough to present here in the seminar, which I'm very, very glad, because I have presented this idea of sphere of authority as an analytical tool some time ago at a conference that you're supposed to attend in Poland in about 10 years ago, I think. But I didn't see you there. Anyway, the idea was born a couple of years ago when I discussed social complexity with political scientists. I sort of deviate from anthropological ideas about social complexity, especially when it comes to political complexity, political systems. And I discussed these ideas with my friends, political scientists, who pointed out several publications to me, and I was interested in this idea of sphere of authority, which we usually associate with religion and religious structures, but it has been used by political scientists to identify level of political integrity. I call it aggregation, because I see spheres of political authority as dynamic entities. They change constantly. These are not stable structures. And this is what I would like to introduce discuss today, this idea of sphere of authority as a concept which we can use to assess a level of political, well, I call it aggregation because of its dynamic, but it could also be called integration or disintegration. If we identify structures that we associate with this, loosely I identify a concept of sphere of authority, because some way say, well, sphere of authority exists at all levels of social complexity. What are you talking about? A family is a sphere of authority, isn't it? Well, that's not exactly what I mean here. Yeah, I will define my idea of sphere of authority in a moment when I start showing you the slides. And one more point here, that today I discuss just an idea. So what I'm going to tell you today is very theoretical. It also derives, these theories also derive from my earlier study in nuclear physics. So I try to fuse certain ideas from nuclear physics, especially thermodynamics, and see if I can apply these ideas to explain complexity in social organization, especially political organization. So I apologize for some of the lingo that I'm going to use in this presentation. Now, my second presentation next week will be more specific about evidence, cases, specific cases where I can identify the existence of spheres of authority, but not just the existence, but the usefulness of this concept. And I use a variety of examples, from archaeological examples through ethnographic to recent modern examples, especially examples from Europe, but also elsewhere. So the next presentation next week will be practically about examples. All right, having said that, let's go to my slides. Most of the time I will be reading of this slide because I think I don't need to comment very much on what I have written in those slides, and then of course I will clarify ideas should you have questions about after my presentation. So let's start with the title of this talk: "Sphere of Authority as an Analytical Unit to Assess Levels of Political Disaggregation or Aggregation." I see both disaggregation and aggregation, or integration and fragmentation, as interesting analytical units to study political systems, to study the structure of political system, especially the dynamics. That is what I'm after: the dynamics of political systems, how they form and how they change. The whole idea that I present here relates to a much bigger question, which I'm not going to discuss today, but I'm preparing a publication on this question, and that is how social complexity happens. Or maybe more specific, is social complexity inevitable? Because if we apply this overwhelmingly popular evolutionary outlook on the rise of complexity, where it seems like it's inevitable, but we have to probably start questioning such ideas. So what I discuss today, I discuss theoretical assumptions to suggest the significance and effectiveness of bifurcated governance, which is a mixture of centralized and polycentric governance. I want to make this very clear that I do not discuss any specific political system or organization, but what interests me is a mixture, is a combination of this, what is sometimes called a institutional political system, institutionalized political system, and non-institutionalized, or not really fully recognized, centrally recognized political entities. So I focus on networks of political organization. That is what interests me: networks of political organization, coalitions of different kinds, actors in their coalitions in the context of political, especially this context is of interest to me, political uncertainty, instability, because I identify such context as what is called in thermodynamics as dissipative phase, which underlines this dynamics of social complexities, fluctuations, how social complexity happens. And I conclude that social dynamics are more complex in the mixture of spontaneous and pattern behaviors of various duration. Some of them will be very short-lived, some may survive for a while. This is significant to mention because, for instance, in the archaeological record, we may not have a record of those short-lived fluctuations, or we may miss the record. So we have to evaluate our data. In a larger context, theoretical context, I sort of try to mix the issue of agency and determinism, but I try to deviate from the deterministic viewpoint as much as I can. So to introduce my ideas, first, I want to point out to what we all know, and that is this evolutionary perspective regarding structural changes in human socio-political organization utilize the notion of stages such as band, tribe, chiefdom, and state. Especially the concept of chiefdom has been recently challenged in several publications. I have also written a paper on that, and I would like to write more. But such a classification, sort of variance of political levels of political organization are stable. They don't show much dynamics. This classification that derives from linear and deterministic reasoning, phrased usually as the evolution of social complexity, a rise of social complexity. So every time you see the title "Rise of Social Complexity," you know what's in it. You know what is in the book. So the author is probably presenting a few more cases, but not new thinking, and it doesn't interest me very much. So here in my presentation, I view change as multilinear mixture of randomness and regularity, and discuss whether social complexity is caused by spontaneous processes, sometimes identified as self-organization. Ostrom was very keen on identifying and researching how people self-organize themselves to form all kinds of decision-making bodies. So here's my approach to see whether people organize themselves spontaneously, and of course they do. Whether those social complexities are governed by deterministic patterns, and on certain occasions they are obviously. For instance, the ecological constraints are very common, or a combination of both, spontaneous and deterministic processes. But in my reasoning, in my view, discussion on this process, I focus specifically on intermediate form of socio-political organizations, those SOAs, which emerge in a non-equilibrium context, so some sort of uncertainty or upheaval. And I argue that the rise of social complexity is multilinear mixture of randomness and regularity caused by a combination of spontaneous processes and deterministic patterns. I'm not going to discuss the last point here today. Again, as I mentioned, this is a topic of my bigger publication that I'm preparing right now. So there are several key questions that drive my thinking about our spheres of authority. And two significant questions are: what is the effective governance capable of ameliorating, if not resolving? I'm not certain if there's political organization can resolve much, but resolving numerous problems that emerge in all kinds of social groupings. And we know that central governments some they seem very strong, but they're not capable of solving many problems, social problems. And the follow-up question here is how to infuse a modicum of order, a measure of effective authority. Any government, centralized or not, must have some sort of authority to generate compliance compliance is the key. So my thinking also circulates around the idea about leadership and problems with generating compliance. There are some additional questions that I ask. All of them relate really to the same big question, and that is centralized governance the correct structure to solve those big problems? If what I say seemed to you a bit anarchistic, well, you're probably right. But I'm not disclosing anything about my ideas about. I had this idea about researching archaeology of anarchy, in the past. Maybe I'll return to that concept, in the future. So all these questions are being asked at every level of community as scalar tensions intensify, and commoners and decision makers ponder how to conduct their affairs in the face of transformative dynamics, which are seemingly out of control. Again, there's very little efficiency when it comes to governments. Governments design big ideas, and they designed certain solutions, but it's difficult to actually accomplish things. So many of these problems with centralized government or structures of political systems, in my view, derive from fast-paced dynamics of change, and a change which is characterized by political fragmentation or integration. Both processes contribute nicely to how fast political systems change. And those forces of fragmentation and integration affect people and social institutions at every level of community, but in opposite directions, which is either forcing choices that favor integration or that favor fragmentation, localization, or creating a bigger regional structures. The EU is a good example of that. Look at how many problems, political problems, that they have within the EU, and how frequently they change their political comments from favoring integration when it comes to certain issues, or favoring fragmentation when it comes to other issues. I observed this very frequently when I spent the last decade or so in France, in southern France, in the Pyrenees, and we discussed a lot of problems the local people had, and how they've tried to solve these problems with ignoring either the French government or even the EU policies. So what I concluded from this, from asking those key questions, especially when it comes to fragmentation and integration or aggregation and disaggregation, is that the dynamic duality, such dynamic duality, can be described as by stating that fragmentation stimulates integration and vice versa. It's a very interesting dynamics here, this clench that characterizes integration. If integration happens, and it happens to a certain point, and beyond that point, which again I would use thermodynamics to explain this point of bifurcation, it explodes, and we see fragmentations, and also, of course, new problems stimulate limit in fragmentation and favor integration for a certain time, and so on and so on. And that's what I call dynamics. Dynamics is really about processes and process and change, how fast change happens. And I see, for instance, that political system or any system you can take have either no equilibrium or several equilibria, fluctuations, and so on. So this is what prompted my thinking about sphere of authority. And I have identified certain characteristics of complexity, dynamics of social complexities. I use the governance theory here, which through which I identified that the governing system and the system to be governed, as well as the interactive systems, those intermediate systems, they form together, share similar structural traits. And they are diverse, complex, dynamic, and vulnerable. These are the specific traits. So vulnerability is about the risk of that system will be damaged or may collapse, like political system. Or conversely, it's about resilience, robustness of the system, which is system's ability to insulate itself from pressure, this outside problems, or to recover from having been exposed to a shock. That's what I identify as vulnerability. It's not just one set of problems or similar problems, but it could be a spectrum. It is a spectrum. Diversity, on the other hand, is about spatial and organizational variation, obviously, as the term suggests. It is about the fact that, for instance, ecosystem and social systems have different characteristics, which vary from place to place. This is where I can see deterministic rules that prevail over agency. Those specific ecosystem characteristics. And finally, what I see as complexity is about interconnectedness and interactions that occur between all the elements of the system. So we like to think that complexity is measured by the number of elements in the system. For instance, states, according to different people, for instance, Greg Johnson from Hunter, he identified a state-level society as having certain levels of decision-making or levels of flow of information. He says 3 of them and more than 3 will be state-level complexities. Well, in my view, the number of elements is significant, obviously, but those interconnections interest me more than levels of elements of the structure. I like to see how they work. So, for instance, if we see the flow of information, this channeling from the top down, as characteristic of state-level society, I ask how it happens. I ask how the information is channeled down and what is going on with the information. How many intermediate decision makers or decision-making bodies will amplify the message or will weaken the message or change it. And if they do, well, they become spheres of authority. They become additional elements of the of the system which are not recognized. So this dynamics of social complexities looks to me a little bit more different than from what some other colleagues have described. So my approach considers the idea of those distributive structures, those emerging and disappearing structures, and I call them spheres of authority, which arise out of nonlinear process in a non-equilibrium system. This is also quite significant that those additional spheres of authority, they usually happen, they arise at times of uncertainty, problems, which I think are common to big state-level political complexities. They're mostly problems that we have. Dissipation, and that's from thermodynamics. Dissipation is an agent for establishing order, which is, if you have certain uncertainty, this dissipative stage will get you back on track for a while, because it develops around certain attractor. The key point is to find out what is the attractor here. It could be ideology, could be economic boom, or could be a person, charismatic leader. But it doesn't matter to me. I'll get back to that in the next week to identify some of the attractors. But what is of interest to me today is that there are two conditions that make the occurrence of dissipative structure more complex than what deterministic models show. And these are, first, that the attractor is not a fixed point, or it is fixed temporarily. And this is why the structure is so dynamic. And the second point here is that energy constantly enters the system and drains out. So this is like to say that this dynamic process is fueled constantly by certain types of energy that may come from different directions, not just one, for instance, law or legal system, but some sort of, let's say, social upheaval, right? The fact that people are dissatisfied with certain measures or policies will voice their opinion. The situation will change, but may not change in a very effective way or institutionalized way. But for a while, it will be very, very new, very dynamic, very innovative. Take a look, for instance, at all revolutions happen that way, fueled by energy initially and then fade away over time. And then, of course, when they fade away, there's an increasing tendency to turn the revolution into not democracy, but a more totalitarian regime, because now the force has to be used to maintain the status quo. So to identify visually what interests me here is what do we study in anthropology, archaeology when it comes to social complexities, or usually this combination of function and structure. But what interests me are those intermediate elements of the structure, sometimes unrecognizable, which are fluctuations of different kinds. Those problems with function or problems with structure. And this is how I came to this theory of fragmentation and integration dynamics, or otherwise known as bifurcated governance. So, I like to explain political systems, and I will use some cases again next Thursday to see that affairs of social complexities, including states, very complex political system, are governed by a bifurcated system. One is the centralized structure, a government system, which does exist as an institution, but may not have much power. Like, you know, you may find this strange, but the American government is not very powerful. It's not like the Russian government, the present government, which I think you will also see as not very powerful on many occasions, unless it uses power, the military might. See, American diplomacy for the past 40 years, as I remember, has been linked to, you know, sending troops to different regions, and then this how the diplomacy is played here. Yeah, and many of all big imperial-like countries do that to maintain their power, to remain in power, which is, you know, on many occasions it's illusionary, but it's not the point. So one is the centralized and structured government system, and the other is a multicentric or polycentric system of diverse types of collectivities that constitute a rival source of authority with actors that cooperate or compete, but constantly interacting with each other, which is a phenomenon that is explained by the collective action theory. And I think we can definitely recognize such entities ethnographically. I have some to show you next week. My question is, can we recognize such entities archaeologically? Here's my visualization of integration and fragmentation. So here's an integration, which seems like a well-organized system. Everything works, but it's functional. It's too functional to me. Such functionalities don't exist in my view. And here we have a fragmentation of fragmented elements, which in my view may form coalitions, those spheres of authority of different kinds and of different duration. So it may look like they're fragmented, but if they form coalitions and those coalitions change, they remain in business. They work, still being recognized as fragmented. So there are certain theoretical assumptions and definitions I want to mention that explain, that contribute to my ideas, and they may clarify certain points. So the concept I wish to introduce is the sphere of authority, and refers to governance, rule system, and authority, which obviously exist in also institutionalized political systems. But I want to make certain things clear. What do I mean by governance? So the word governance indicates interdependence in governing. Interdependence. Governance as government consists of rule systems, but they're not necessarily the same rule systems, but they all regulate steering mechanisms through which authority is exercised, and how the system and regulate how the system works. what is significant to remember is the rule systems are social functions or processes. These are not structures. I'll show you this in a moment. So they can be performed and implemented in a variety of ways at different times and places and by a wide range of organizations. So governance is also a complex concept because it is an intersection of leadership, accountability, and management. That's how I would describe it in the most simple way. Now, the rule systems are significant because they underlie the existence of this process of governance. They regulate governance. So the rule system of governments are structures. We have, judicial system. We have executive office, and so on. So these are structures. Whereas those of governance are social functions or processes, not just structures, or not necessarily structures, but functions. But whether structural or functional, rule systems acquire authority. And I think on certain occasions, for instance, if we think of social movements, any social movement is an attempt to govern. It's what I would identify as governance. And social movements, they acquire authority. People follow the leaders, or they follow the idea, not the leaders. Forget the leaders. They follow the idea. Right. It's interesting to say it because, for instance, social justice is a very common term these days in the United States. Everybody wants social justice, but not everybody knows what this means or what is required to achieve social justice. And people argue about how to do it, but they don't argue about the idea of social justice. So of all those, whether functional or structural, all those systems require authority. And the authority may range from informal, this is what I like, informal type of authority, which is usually created through processes and repeated practices. People practice the idea. And institutional authority, which are those structures, elements of the structure that we know. I have some of those ideas here. So the rule systems, folkways and taboos, and morality is a big issue in the rule system because different people identify different things as good and bad, right? Yeah, but not anyway. It's always presented as this bipolar opposition, good or bad. Rarely something in between. And the most institutional rule system, which is law, the legal system, where customs and traditions and norms don't matter. This is very especially significant in multi-ethnic and multicultural societies. I don't like the word ethnic, but multicultural societies, where different people might have different approach to morality, for instance, so folkways or taboos, but it becomes irrelevant because the legal system eradicates those cultural differences and imposes a one system. But it's not significant. What is significant about rule systems is that rule systems emerge due to negotiation and consensus. That's what, in my view, is the rule system, or the key characteristics of a rule system. It's not imposed. We're not trying to. I don't try to see it as this imperial or colonial type of rule system. imposed by dominating power. No, it emerges through negotiation and consensus. This is significant to understand my concept of spheres of authority. So these rule systems are sustained by cooperation among all kinds of collectivities, whether in centralized or multi-agent of polycentric structure. And because those collectivities change, because their goals change and practices change, so it's very dynamic entity, very dynamic process. But what is required here is cooperation. And of course, people form all kinds of coalitions depending on what is the goal, what they want to achieve at the moment. Cooperative networks of different scales successfully diminish hierarchical form of organization in favor of horizontal flow of authority by contributing to disaggregation of authority and to the formation of new collectivities not founded on hierarchical principles. This is how I would probably describe very briefly this new rule system that I discuss here. This is not necessarily to what is sometimes known as heterarchy. Heterarchy is also structural, but it resembles the structure of heterarchy because all those cooperative networks, they're changeable, they change constantly, again, depending on what is the goal. So they're not really alternatives to centralization or central government. Heterarchy is an alternative. My idea is not to replace central government, but to understand how centralization is supported by a variety of other political entities. Or sometimes it works in addition to central government, which may not be conflicting. I don't want to put it in a context of conflict. You know, that's not my intention here. I see those networks as supportive, to infuse order and especially effectiveness of decision making. Like, for instance, the idea of vaccination. Why do people? So many people do not want to vaccinate. You know, if we have successful cooperating organizations who will introduce the idea of vaccination or what does it mean to be vaccinated in the first place, well, maybe we wouldn't have so many problems. But obviously, central institutions, CDC, is not good enough to propagate the idea. They can generate some sort of, you know, guidelines, but that's about it. And finally, to finish this section on rule systems, the proliferation of rule systems is propagated by the evolution of multi-level governance that ranges from family to federation of states. You can, as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, you can see this idea, I mean, this concept present in all kinds of decision-making contexts. Another definition that needs explanation is authority. And what I see as authority is socially approved use of power. I emphasize socially approved, not imposed. So to govern whether a structural function is this to exercise authority. And to have authority is to be recognized as having the right to govern, to make decisions. And I always wonder, when it comes to leadership, for instance, how come people become leaders? What is this process of becoming a leader, and why millions follow one guy, one leader who might be a complete idiot? What happens? In other words, why such people gain so much authority? And I know we have rules and on the voting systems and democratic systems and so on, but nonetheless, it's the question is still valid in my view, and that's what I mean by authority. How come people gain so much power so they can lead millions or billions when it comes to religious leaders, for instance? So authority to me connotes the sum of all the diverse efforts of communities at every level to move towards goals while preserving the coherence from one moment in time to the next. What is essential here is this emphasis on preserving the coherence. The group, the network, the coalition must be preserved, otherwise the leader has no right to lead. So, in other words, authority is defined by compliance, the level of compliance, and thus it is relational, and it needs to be treated as continuum expressed by two extremes. No compliance to full compliance, and anything in between. So here's my visualization of authority. Again, why is this one guy able to attract attention of so many? But again, this is not the point of my discussion today. I just want to point out what I mean by authority, because it is significant to understand the concept of sphere of authority. So as I mentioned earlier about authority, sphere of authority are the sum of all those diverse efforts of communities at every level to move towards goals while preserving their coherence at different times. It could be any type of coalition, any network, social network. I'm going to disclose one thing here. I'm looking now at archaeological record, and I'm using a method of social network analysis to see if I can identify different spheres of authority in my records I have from Central Europe, but I'm working on it. I may mention some of that next week, next Thursday. But what is essential to remember about spheres of authority is that they're impermanent and change with increased demand for governance. And thus, the conceptualization of a sphere of authority is not evolutionary. This is not an evolutionary entity. Evolutionary ideas will not explain the existence, will not even recognize the existence of spheres of authority. Here's one interesting example, the real example of sphere of authority, and it's power of governance. This is about mining activities in the Arctic, which I found very interesting. Take a look at how many coalitions here, how many groupings, and all these groups and coalitions, they may have different goals to achieve, well, except one, which is economic. But take a look at how they form those coalitions. We have EU here, but we have also separate EU countries. Denmark is one, and Finland. Russia is not. Sweden is one. Norway is not. But they are in one and the same network, which means they cooperate somehow. We have indigenous people who are not in the same network as the EU countries, but they're in a network with certain countries. We have other countries, non-European countries, and so on, and even different corporations. You can, you may think of, by looking at this, you may think, well, there are many who would like to abuse the Arctic, especially when it comes to mining activities for all kinds of metals and oil and so on. But yes, that's true. This is all very aggressive approach to mining, but it's not my point. My point is to show you how they form coalitions, how they form spheres of authorities, supported by in some cases by indigenous people. At least two spheres are supported by indigenous people for different reasons. So I'm getting to my conclusions here. Now we'll take a few minutes. First, what is the rationale of sphere of authority, which is what justifies polycentric decision making? I'll get back to that question next week. But for instance, one example I can use here is that centralized conservation efforts generally have failed. The resources necessary to impose top-down strategies are dwindling. And therefore, there is a demand for more inclusive decision-making structures, and that demand is growing. Inclusion is the key word here behind it, the rationale of SOA. And another rationale is that if individuals in a group can respond collectively to changes, the group becomes a complex adaptive system. Adaptive system, that is a very significant issue here. So cooperating groups may solve problems faster, all kinds of problems faster and better in a way that individuals cannot. Individuals meaning individual persons, but also individual governments. For instance, climate change, consequences of climate change, that cannot be solved by individual, by different governments. It has to be a global effort. Otherwise, it's pointless. Well, maybe not pointless, but it will not solve much. So such cooperating groups, SOAs, they do not need a leader, institutionalized leader, or decision-making center in solving basic problems such as hunting for food, for instance, or finding shelter, or even more complex decisions like constructing a defense system. And that's what I see, for instance, in my archaeological record. SOAs also contribute to distribution of power, a certain type of or pattern of distribution of power. And if regions are to be governed by multiple SOAs that collectively constitute a new order, the key to their ability to govern is in assessing the degree to which they can invoke the compliance of the people whom they seek to mobilize. I point out that the attractor here could be an idea, not just a person. And such governance is characterized by increasing this aggregation of authority and growing authority, meaning this official institutionalized authority, I should say, and growing numbers of SOAs supported by people of multiple identities, which is another interesting issue, that a sphere of authority could be may incorporate people of different identities, not just one, but people who are who follow a certain idea or who subscribe to a certain concept. And obviously, if the scenario I discussed here, suggesting the significance of SOAR, is true, then a centralized leadership becomes irrelevant. But this might be a risky statement now. I work to back it up with some data. Okay. Compliance is another big issue with SOAR, and this is the key problem with any authority, whether structural or functional. To generate compliance, governments act through formal codes, legitimation of power, for instance, constitution, while the effectiveness of governance derives from other sources, traditions, customs, informal agreements, common history, common identity, etc. And informal rule systems can be found in many types of collectivities or social groupings, not considered to be governments or complex level political systems such as states. So the key to understanding the role of SOARs in governance is not in their legal prerogatives. I don't care whether they're legally recognized or not, but in assessing the degree to which they are able to evoke compliance. And compliance is the key to leadership and politics, and it is achieved in different ways to sustain the level of effectiveness of SOAR, not discussed today because we don't have time. So examples of SOARs, as I will be discussing those examples next week, but groups exhibiting evidence of cooperation and group action, collective management of common pool resources, especially in this area, and participatory governance exemplify the existence of multi-level SOARs. So my conclusions for today, I would like to say 3 points. I would just make 3 points today, and maybe more will come up later. But first, the first point is that the more pluralistic the polity with SOARs, the less can one of them dominate the other. So SOARs contribute to a certain balance of power within otherwise legally recognized and legitimate, for instance, state-level society. I would argue that the existence of SOARs is critical to the functionality and success of institutionalized government. Another point is that people require security from the social groups they organize. They like to see a certain level of comfort and security. So there is a tendency towards social groupings and aggregations that stimulate the organization of SOARs due to scalar stress. So the more complex societies become, there will be more those political coalitions, so as informal coalitions. And the final point here is that the advent of networks and the flow of horizontal information enable an increase of people to participate in governance or governance process, and thus creating the conditions for the introduction of new solutions to old problems. I think that's a very significant point here. So I think I will stop it there because the time is up, and I'll gladly answer your questions if you have any. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ludomir. Well, and actually, we are opening the floor for questions and comments. So, who would like to say something or to ask something? Well, okay, then maybe I will begin. So, I liked a lot of what you have said. Especially I like the way you are trying your best, and actually you are a success in combining the opposites in your theoretical analysis of centralization and decentralization. Fragmentation, defragmentation. So you bring all this together, I shall say, very keenly. And I also appreciated the nonlinear nature of your approach, and actually also your argument that the sphere of authority is not an evolutionary notion, and much more. And also, by the way, your justification of polycentric decision making and the new order of regions government. What I wanted to ask is something concerned with the relations, possible relations between your arguments, your views, and some theories that already exist. So probably, first of all, I would like to ask you the following. Well, you conceptualize the notion of the sphere of authority. So, and actually, from this perspective, you actually made the whole point. But I recall what particularly Deleuze and Guattari have written, that in any society, in any culture actually, there are spheres which remain outside, beyond the reach of any authority. And if we look at a society as a whole, how can you specify your view of society as a arena for where the sphere of authority manifests itself, and that postulate of Deleuze and Guattari, that there are always spheres which remain beyond the reach of any authority? How the society develops, changes from this perspective? This is the first question.
Right. Yeah, thank you. That's a complex question. I'm not sure if I will be able to answer all those nuanced points that you made in this question. But first of all, I think that it will be difficult to argue that there are certain spheres of authority that, as you put it, cannot be reached by certain authorities. My point is that no authority is complete. There is no such thing as complete authority. You know, we live in this imaginary world, which is mostly due to our 20th century ideas about government or governments. That government has the overwhelming power, and whatever government says, it must be true, or it's the best decision, and so on. No, it's not true. It's not a bad decision. It is driven by political interests or economic interests, or a combination of both, and it serves certain people and doesn't serve other people, and so on. We have to recognize this. Government, in my view, but because it is seminar, so we can present here in a half-cooked idea. ideas. So, but governments are really failures. I don't see a successful government unless the government becomes dictatorial and imposes a top-down a structure and ideas, and then flow of information is clear. So all people comply with what the government says, not because they like, not because they feel the government with their approval. So the government has their authority, but because they fear the government, right? And such governments, they cannot be successful. So there is no really authority that is fully complete, that is accepted by all the people. And I think that's good. It's not bad. It's actually good, because the opposition, people who oppose or have different ideas, alternative ideas, may actually introduce something that is acceptable, again, not to all, but to some. So we do recognize multiple levels of authority, spheres of authority in any society. If I look at a band of foragers, in Namibia, I look how they make decisions, and none of those decisions are really centralized. So we call them egalitarian people, but this equality has been questioned, and of course they form coalitions with other men versus women or mixed genders and so on, and they make decisions in a very interesting way, which is very much a corporate way. And the same with complex state-level societies. Governments impose ideas, but they have no authority. They impose ideas because they know they have been legitimized through voting experience. They have been voted, so they have this authority of people who voted into office to do things. But it's it's temporary. That's why we have terms. It's temporary. So spheres of authority change constantly, even in formal or formally recognized governments. And we have to recognize those because they contribute. The existence of those spheres, alternative spheres of authority, contributes to complexity. So I would even question the notion of no complex society or less complex society. What do you mean by less complex society? Is the society less complex because it's not as complex as mine? That's nonsense. Society is less complex because of other things, but if you use the term less, it's relative, right? It's very relative. Again, I may have problems with the term because of my background is physics, but it's relative. You cannot really apply this term unless you want to present your ideas from a very, ex cathedra, very like we used to have those guys in the 19th and early 20th century Anglo-Saxons, anthropologists, who say, well, my view is the best because I'm the best, right? And everybody followed. Germans, look at the history of German science. It's a great science, but how it influenced ideas around the world. And it took about 50 years to say, well, wait a minute, maybe it's not like we're supposed to do things. So the same with spheres of authority, but I recognize the dynamics of such spheres. It has to be recognized. Because I know they're suppressed by centralized governments. They try to suppress those spheres of authority. Some even say, like it happened in a communist Russia, that we have invented the idea of dissidents. And who are those dissidents? Well, dissidents are people with different ideas, but they were presented as enemies because they dare to offer an alternative point of view. Right, dissidents. I don't know. I'm not sure dissident is the right term. It is just a different. I use the term attracted to a certain idea that around which people organize, and its alternative is different. It doesn't mean it's against the people. It's definitely not against the people. It's against the ideology that the government has or wants to practice. So spheres of authority do exist everywhere, but they haven't been recognized because of, I think, because of, or their significance hasn't been recognized because of our way of thinking, which is stuck on this traditional way of understanding social complexity, for instance, because we like classifications, we like taxonomies. So we say band level is not the same as tribal, or chiefdom is not the same as states. I don't know. That's what I like to question. To me, taxonomies do not explain anything. Taxonomies are useless. Actually, they contribute to our reductionist way of viewing things. It's a very reductionist. But on the other hand, I understand, humans, we comprehend things, we comprehend reality through taxonomies, because if we do not classify things as this or that, then we don't understand what we see. And what I'm proposing here is a different way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Well, you know that there is a clear tradition of creating taxonomic schemes in anthropology. You mentioned them yourself. And actually, there were proposed some very, I shall not say clear, even simple, I shall say, criteria, like by Flannery, if I'm not mistaken. The number of levels of complexity of political institutions above the community, like that. So anyway, such schemes would lead us to place the Western culture on the European in general, I don't know how to say, on the top of that pyramid. But in any case, the very problem of taxonomic thinking and validity of taxonomic schemes for particularly anthropology is very important, and it's a strong point you are making. And if you can have a look at chat, so there is a message from David Small, so I will read for all. A nice job in setting up your framework. I am interested in how this applies to ancient cultures in the Mediterranean and Central America. I will hold my questions until you present your cases. So maybe you will take into account David's message while preparing your talk next week. So maybe you will refer to some Mediterranean and Central American cases. So
right, David is very right here. That Mediterranean or Central American societies, we are fortunate to have written records, not just archaeological material, but also written records. So we can compare. We can have additional source of information about to explain what we see in the archaeological records. So it's probably much easier, in my view, to recognize those spheres of authority in such societies for which we have additional source of information. And before my talk today, I also thought about the same thing, that if we look at Central America, it will be probably the best archaeologically known society or cultures that we can go to and examine. I will have to talk to Gary Feynman and see what he says about that, but it might be interesting. And also Mediterranean world, definitely the Greeks and Romans, especially Romans, So I'm not sure if I have my cases from the cases I have are from that context. But I will take a look. Maybe I'll have more from the area.
Okay.
But let's wait till next Thursday to discuss this question.
Okay. So any other questions now? Okay. Then probably one more from me from the same perspective of interrelation of your thoughts with the existing theories. While we're talking about the rise of rule systems, of course, I, on the one hand, thought of some structuralist approaches, but on the other hand, I thought that what you were saying could be this or that way related to the collective, to the theory of social acceptance, theory of institutions elaborated in social philosophy, and probably to be closer to ecology and anthropology, to the collective action theory, which in my view is a manifestation of that philosophical theory I've mentioned in anthropology and archaeology. So how can you, do you see any relation between your theory and collective action theory in anthropology of Blanton, you know, Farger and others?
Right. Actually, it's a very interesting question, because this is what I and Rich Blanton talked about many years ago, and when we discussed collective action and Ostrom ideas, how we can use them in archaeology. I published a paper in your journal in the history of social
evolution.
Right, and which Blanton liked very much for some reason, and even suggested that maybe we can publish something together. But yeah, definitely, collection action theory underlines my concept of spheres of authority, because the spheres of authority do not exist outside of cooperation. But the question is about scale. So cooperation, in my view, you know, the simple cooperation that happens at the family level is good enough for me. It doesn't have to be on a regional level. It does exist at a family level, which archaeologically will not be well recognized. But if it does exist at the village level, then we can try to look for it archaeologically, the village level, or within the village. Definitely possibilities exist to see it, spheres of authority, many different spheres of authority at regional levels, and that's what I want to discuss next time when I look at settlement pattern in my area of research, and distribution of artifacts. And as I mentioned, I use this method of social network analysis, which is a graphic representation of distribution of certain artifacts, or whatever you identify as a common denominator that may unite or link people together. Could be the size of the house, or the shape, or architecture, different things. So yes, collective action theory is the starting point here. But a collection action theory explain, for instance, it explained Göbekli Tepe. Remember that? You may not remember Göbekli Tepe, but it's a Stone Age Stonehenge, in Turkey.
Yeah.
So the question is, how come those foragers, those hunters and gatherers, who are presumably not organized in any hierarchical way, constructed such a big, enormous monument compatible with Stonehenge, for which as the traditional classic theory goes, Stonehenge was possible because of the rise of power and the concentration of power and control of people and so on. It's a very Marxist way of explaining things. Whereas in my view, if you look at Göbekli Tepe, well, I like Marx, but no need to go to to Marx's idea. You can explain Göbekli Tepe by using collective action theory and the sphere of authority. People organized around certain attractor that it was an idea, not a person, not a leader, but an idea, right? And look what they build. If this is true, then we must take another look at all those big constructions and how we explain them. The pyramids, or whether in Mesoamerica or in Egypt, big architectural monuments of China, and so on. The organization, the practical aspect, is one thing. But then is, of course, the question is how to organize, how to motivate people to do it.
Thank you.
And collective action theory is a good starting point here.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure there will be many more questions when you present your argument, using some evidence. But are there any questions now? Any more questions now? Or we shall postpone the rest of the questions for the second meeting with Dr. L.Lozny. So, Ludomir, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much to everybody for taking part in our seminar. I'm pretty sure that Ludomir's thoughts are very provocative for us all, and I'm sure that Ludomir will substantiate them, ground them even deeper, next week. So thank you very much once again, and all the very best to you all, and see you next Thursday. Thank you. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Dmitry. Thank you. See you next Thursday.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.